Okay, good morning everyone. I'm sorry to break up the discussions. It's really wonderful to see you all come in and not just enjoy refreshments but each other's company. It's a sure sign that it can be a really good conversation amongst friends and colleagues on what is a really pressing and important issue. For those that don't know me, I'm Charles Keedon, I edit Alliance, and each of our quarterly issues focuses on a particular topic. As many of you will know, this topic today is on human rights philanthropy. Each of our issues has an in-depth feature, and thanks to our guest editors who are introduced in a moment, we have some really great coverage of the topic from a variety of perspectives. I think this is one of our most global issues. We endeavour to provide a global viewpoint, even though we're a charity, a non-profit media outlet based in London. We try to make sure there's a variety of global perspectives, and that's really the case in this issue. That's something I'm particularly proud about, and it's really thanks to them. The objective of our discussion today is really to highlight some of the controversies, issues, questions that are raised in human rights philanthropy, drawing on this issue. And to assess how well we do that, please do fill in the feedback forms that you'll have on the sheet so we can learn and do things better and continually improve. Before I do introduce the panellists, I do want to make a few observations about the relationship between human rights and philanthropy. Why human rights is so important to philanthropy. I think on one level, obviously, human rights is a basis for the rule of law and for a democratic functioning society. But there's another reason as well, that philanthropy is, maybe in its core basis, is about challenging, one of its roles is to challenge orthodoxy, foster dissent, change the status quo. And those objectives are very much consistent with what drives much human rights action. So I think philanthropy and human rights have much in common, which I think was one of the reasons why this issue was so interesting to do. The second point I make is that when you talk about human rights, which is 5% of all philanthropic funding, more or less, depending on how we look at the figures, we're really talking about liberal philanthropy. Sometimes we see philanthropy as homogenous. All of it contributed to the public good in particular ways or forms. But actually, we might be talking about a clash of political orientations in philanthropy. In my editorial, I note that there's conservative philanthropy that has backed some of the most regressive people, organisations and ideas, both in America and around the world, leading, I say in the editorial, to some conservatives taking over the commanding heights of law and public policy in the US. We might see something like that in the UK and elsewhere too. But equally we have liberal philanthropy pushing back. Many of us in the philanthropy world are committed to those principles of more liberal philanthropy. That might be more true of foundation staff than the philanthropists themselves in some cases, maybe not, depending on how and where they made their money and how they interact. But I think there's very important questions about what liberal philanthropy can do. And even though I've mentioned that this is a global issue, I think it would be remiss not to be thinking about the UK context as well, seeing as we're in the UK. And one thought here is, in his interview for Alliance, Adrian Arena notes right at the end about the challenges that are occurring on our own back door. I think he was thinking probably more in the context of across Central and Eastern Europe and pushbacks on freedoms, but I don't think that's also the UK can be accepted from that. And some of you might be feeling some of the anger and frustration as philanthropy practitioners about what's happening and our ability to influence what's happening. So I think there is a question for you and for all of us about what role liberal philanthropy will play in the context of some of the UK debates that are occurring. So those are just some opening thoughts. In the invitation we raised the question about the global human rights predicament, how bad it is, who are the major human rights funders, is the human rights movement really facing a difficult time? Is it being unfairly blamed for forces beyond its control? And what about economic and social rights? Have they been too neglected with the focus on civil and political rights? Those are all themes that really came across in the issue. And to speak about them now, I'm really delighted to turn to our panellists. Julie Broome, who is the director of Ariadne, the European Human Rights and Social Change Funding Network, former programme director at the Sigrid Rousing Trust, and delighted to have the new director in the room of the Sigrid Rousing Trust as well. Duncan, welcome. John Kabia from the Fund for Global Human Rights, from Sierra Leone but based in London, bringing different perspectives as well. And then to respond to some of these themes, Deborah Doane, formerly of Fix, but now a partner at Rights CoLab and a commentator on some of these issues. So I'm going to now pass the floor over to Julie. Before I do, I just want to say thank you for your role in pulling this issue together. I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on how it's gone.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this early morning to have this conversation with us. It's great to see lots of familiar faces and new faces in the room. This was a really interesting time, I think, to try to do this issue and really think about what human rights philanthropy means right now in this context. I think if we'd done this 10 years ago, it would have been a very different kind of conversation about, where is philanthropy going and the human rights movement and why should people be supporting it. Whereas right now, it really does feel like we're on the defensive in a way that we weren't before. Really having to justify the human rights movement and what it's doing and why. A time of extreme polarization in the world in general. I don't think that I need to elaborate on that for most of us. We're all experiencing it probably in our own lives and relationships with people. That there are very strong views out there and a lot of pushback against the concept of human rights. And I would say there's a pushback on the one hand against some of the mechanisms at the state level, UN mechanisms, for example, for human rights, and that's playing out on a political level, but I think also on a societal level, there's a lot of challenges about, what are human rights and what do they mean for people? An idea, that's promoted largely by some of those conservative forces that you mentioned, that in some ways human rights are privileging minorities over other parts of the population. So I think if we look at the EU and a minister for protecting the European way of life, that really says a lot about how people perceive human rights right now, and why there is this sense that we shouldn't be sort of protecting minorities because that's harmful to others. I think there's also another challenge that the human rights sector and the human rights movement has been experiencing, which is that in the past it's often been lawyers who do human rights, and that's been their purview, and it's seen as very much an elitist profession and an elitist group of people, and we're seen as disconnected from much of the rest of the population. So I think there's a real challenge to us that many organizations and many funders have been taking on in recent years about how do we really start to build bridges and communicate better about who we are and what we're doing and why we think this is for the benefit of everyone and not just for a few, prisoners and terrorists and other kinds of minorities. So in putting together this issue, having all of this kind of background in our minds, some of the things that I thought it was important to draw out was really to understand a little bit about what's driving some of this, and I think Matthew Hart's piece on the rise of religious conservatisms and the relationship with LGBTI rights was important in doing that and kind of showing some of what Charles was referencing, that there are very strong forces with a lot of money that are aligning with churches and conservative leaders to really push back against some of the gains that have been made by the human rights movement in the last 20, 30 years. Abortion, gay marriage, these kinds of issues are really under attack and under threat. But it's quite orchestrated, and I think that his piece really helped draw some of that out. We also thought it was really important to hear from a very diverse group of actors, not just people working in the global north, not just people working on particular kinds of issues, but to really try to show the breadth and depth of human rights philanthropy around the world. And I think John will probably talk a little bit more about that. And finally, I really want to recognize that even though this is a challenging time, and even though this is a difficult issue to work on and to support, because funders do sometimes themselves come under challenge for the work that they support. I mean, Open Society Foundations is probably the most visible example of that, having to close its office in Budapest, move to Berlin. One of the interviews in here is with director of the former Turkey office, having to go into exile and move to Berlin as well. It isn't easy, basically, to do this work, but nonetheless that we have been seeing that there is an increase in funding for human rights. The data provided by Human Rights Funders Network and Candid really shows that there is an ongoing commitment, and I think the data that they provide also indicate that this isn't just a project of money flowing from the global north to the global south and east, but that there is a lot of philanthropy actually being generated in the global south and east for these issues as well, which this is very much a global issue with global support, and I think that that's also important to keep in mind.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you for that introduction, points that we will be returning to in the discussion. John?
Yeah. Thanks, Charles, and thanks everyone for coming. I would like to start by saying it's been a pleasure working with my co-editors, Julie and Carola, but also to acknowledge the insights and input from a diverse range of actors, including colleagues at the Fund for Global Human Rights where I work, but also activists from across the world who are themselves contributors to this issue. When Charles reached out to me in June to explore if I would be interested in being a guest editor, I think that was an easy decision for me to make. I remember meeting in the morning in a kind of a busy and noisy foyer of the Foundry discussing this, because this has been part of ongoing conversations for us at the organization where I work, the Fund, but also peer organizations and platforms and networks to which we are members. I think both Charles and Julie have mentioned the backlash that the human rights community is facing, and over the past few years we've been asking ourselves hard questions. What is behind this, and what could we do as funders? I think the first thing is the acknowledgement that whilst we're not taking our responsibility, but we also have to really dig deep to see what is it that we have not been doing very well. So this came at the right time, so thanks for having the opportunity. And for me, I think what was also really critical was to ensure that we bring in voices from a diverse geographies, diverse sections of society, and especially having worked in the Global South and myself coming from the Global South, I think it was important that we draw from those voices. Oftentimes, our grantees and partners we work with tell us they are often used as subjects of research or journalistic interest, and not the authors of their own stories. So this is why when this opportunity came up, I saw this as a great chance to really recommend and reach out to some of these voices who could help bring a different perspective. And I'm pleased that my co-editors and Charles were really receptive and open to welcoming these voices. And another key point, and which came out very, especially in one of the contributors here, is around how do we connect, how do the human rights movement broadly better connect with the real, the needs and the realities of communities and people we serve on the ground. For years, not just in the Global South, but even here, we've been seeing a growing disconnect from what human rights groups do and what are the real issues that resonates with local communities and local people. And one of these is what we call the bread and butter issues, And economic, social, and cultural rights have often almost felt like the neglected part of the human rights system. Not that people are not working on it, but it's often seen as the nice to have, like we said in this issue. These are not critical. Let's put more resources and attention on civil and political rights. And what that has done over the years is to really, build a growing disconnect, ensuring that people don't feel they see human rights activists and organizations as elitist, disconnected, or don't even understand their realities. As one of the contributors here, Victoria from Spaces for Change in Nigeria, so aptly captured it. What does the right to vote mean to someone who is hungry, or is thirsty and struggles to put a roof over their head? So it's about, and in this piece, we are not in any way arguing for hierarchy of these two body of rights, but basically saying we need to get better at how we marry the two, how to build stronger connections, because oftentimes wider human rights abuses are underpinned by inequalities, both social and economic inequalities. So actually working on economic, social, and cultural rights is at the same time strengthening concrete civil and political rights and realization of those rights. And I'm not saying here, we are not saying there's not been work around promoting access to services and livelihoods. We've seen a lot of that work going on, especially by NGOs and NGOs across the world. But the framing, the approach has been the challenge, because often this work has been framed as kind of service delivery, development, or charity to beneficiaries, passive beneficiaries, people who are just there to receive, who don't have the agency for themselves. And what we're really arguing here, and what economic, social, and cultural rights are really pushing for rights holders, for services and livelihoods to be couched in the language of rights, so that communities and individuals can really have the right, the ability to demand, of their government, and hold those governments accountable, rather than just being seen as handouts, to passive individuals. And that for us is a big part of this. And I'm really delighted to highlight, to be able to attract some of voices from the Global South, like I said, Victoria from Spaces for Change in Nigeria. Victoria and our organization, Spaces for Change, work in some of the most challenging context. Talking about gap between rich and poor, Lagos really epitomizes that. You could see some of the richest building or people next to some of the most deprived communities in the world. And what has been happening in this part of Nigeria is oftentimes poor people being dispossessed, forcefully displaced from their land to make way. At first they will tell them, oh, we want to beautify the city, this is not healthy for you. But oftentimes what often happens, and so many times, is that these displacements make way for huge mega developments for the rich, displacing people, and those activists who stand up for these rights are often criminalized, stigmatized, and Julie mentioned some of the other attacks that activists are facing. So Spaces for Change and Victoria are really at the forefront, mobilizing communities to push back, to hold the communities accountable, to saying, we have a right. This is not, you're not doing us a favor. And I think that work is very crucial, because without that, no matter whatever rights these communities have, they really count to nothing. If the right to even have a roof over your head is not guaranteed, what does that mean for you to vote for a representative? So that, for me, was a very powerful contribution and argument that came from the activists from the Global South. And I'm sure what Victoria discussed or argued here is not just unique to Nigeria. We see it all around us.
Yeah. So there was a very much differences of opinion, shall we say, and how much you should speak out about the issue when civil society and philanthropy and human rights are being threatened. And I'm firmly on the side that philanthropy needs to be open in defending its values and its space. I don't think it's fair for OSF to be the lightning rod for these things. It's happened in Canada. I'm from Canada. Tides Foundation, Co-op Bank were hit out at being called foreign agents when they tried to fund activism of Indigenous communities around the tar sands, the Canadian tar sands. So that rhetoric, anti-foreign funding, is everywhere, and I think we need to stand up and own it and not just let the grantees speak about it and take it themselves. I think there's a big role in being more vocal. And also on the bravery issue, I think it's about taking risks. Now is not the time to sit back and do 3 years of analysis on what might work and what won't work. I think now is the time to actually take some risks, put some core funding out there, experiment, appreciate there will be failure. Not every group is going to succeed in suddenly defending human rights and opening up our democratic spaces and fighting for economic rights. At the end of a 3-year grant, you won't be able to say, tick, done. So I think now's the time to take risks and be more vocal and open. I think that's a key thing. That's probably where I'll leave it. I really liked the editorial, and I think the broad issues were covered very nicely. But if I was to leave with one message, it's about take risks, be brave, don't sit back, be vocal, and deal with corporate power, which is a real challenge for philanthropy because a lot of the money, of course, is earned through corporate power.
Well, perhaps we just come straight, thank you, Deborah,
Yeah.
and come straight just on corporate power, because maybe there were some observations about it, but we didn't focus on it more centrally. Was that just an oversight, or was it just that there's so many issues we could have touched on, or are there some of your members within Ariadne that are looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is an oversight. I would agree with you. I think there were some places, so there's so many issues. I think some of the issues that we commissioned things on could have touched on that, perhaps didn't. But I think it is just, the challenge of you've got a limited number of articles. But I would say that donors are taking this issue on, certainly, in the work that they're doing, even if that's not reflected here. I think the issue that Deborah has raised about tech, definitely there's a clear intersection there between the power of Google and Facebook and others, and how they're sort of pushing an agenda that is not respective of our human rights. I think we also see that around climate change as well. Sort of donors who are increasingly taking on climate issues from a human rights perspective are seeing that the agenda that is leading to more climate change is being pushed by, this is corporate power on a major scale that's really standing in the way of us bringing human rights to the table and really thinking about how individual people in vulnerable situations versus tax breaks for corporations, and we see it a lot in the human rights defender field as well. When you're thinking about where are the threats emanating from for human rights defenders, one who are facing digital threats, physical threats, violence in many cases, on the ground, often that is also being perpetrated by private security firms of private corporations, as well as by states. So it is a major issue, and I think it is something that's on the radar of many foundations, but certainly could be elevated more and needs to be recognized. And I think that that's one of the shifts, actually, that we're seeing in the human rights movement, or that we have seen over the last 10, 15 years. Initially this was designed as a state-to-state project. All of the treaties were initially framed as states as violators, but clearly many corporations are much more powerful than many states right now. And those corporations are the ones that have the ability to violate human rights and not be held accountable. So there have been efforts underway to create more of a legal framework that enables us to hold states to account. And John actually probably can say much more about that than I can.
Come back to you, John, in a minute. One just other follow-up question for you, Julie. We will open up discussion in a moment. One of the insights that came up from one of the early pieces in the special feature from, I think, Human Rights Funders Network, from their recent kind of survey of human rights funding, is that where funders are associated with some of the human rights funding networks, their funding is more purposeful, more strategic, and more collaborative. And obviously you sit within and you manage and coordinate a quite large network of funders and individuals. How how do you see that in the European context? Because when we talk about this 5% of human rights funding, 2.8 billion a year, the vast majority of it is not associated either consciously as being human rights funding. It's just categorised in that way because it might fit with those categories, nor are those funders part of networks, which might lead to some of the problems you're mentioning, where funding isn't actually framed in the way that it might be to have a more kind of focused lens on power and accountability and human rights. So what do you see happening at Ariadne in relation to this, and funders you work with there? Can you enlarge that tent?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for us in the European context, the challenge has been, as John was alluding to, that human rights are seen as very political. So hence Ariadne's sort of tagline is social change and human rights. That was actually a conscious change. We were established as a human rights network and we changed to social change and human rights network. And that is in order to bring some of those people, those other funders into the tent and actually help them highlight how the work that they're doing, though it might have a different tag on it, is actually human rights work. And I think, that's driven in part because of the tax frameworks in different countries. Human rights are not necessarily seen as charitable. So I think part of our challenge and part of our mission is to, help identify what is already being funded that actually does have a human rights dimension to it, does have human rights implications, but people might not be using those words. And unfortunately, those words are increasingly toxic for all of the reasons that we've talked about. So I think we need to start finding new language or adjusting ourselves to new language that people are more comfortable with while trying to serve the same aims.
The reason I asked that, and thank you for your perspective on it, is looking at the list of the top human rights funders. You look at page 37, it lists the top 10. Number 9 on that list is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so it's the 9th largest human rights funder. They might not associate themselves, they're funding some of it they might associate to human rights, but often not, and yet they're listed as giving $93 million and 9th human rights funders, so they're part of the statistics of human rights philanthropy. So, at the moment, the Gates Foundation is about to, or has just awarded a prize to the leader of India, Modi, for their work on sanitation. And many human rights activists, including within the philanthropy sector, are raising questions about whether they should be doing that to recognise his work, Modi's work in one area, on services, sanitation services, but neglecting maybe alleged abuses that Modi has been responsible for in others, in Kashmir and elsewhere. So, if we are enlarging the tent to include a foundation like Gates in this space, they're listed as a human rights funder, what conversations are happening with philanthropy between maybe human rights funders that are concerned about those abuses of human rights in India and those that would want to bring a foundation like Gates into the tent? I'll ask you that question then. And of course that's a question to raise to all of you, but it seems to me that if we're not putting those questions on the table, then we might not be able to move the debate forward, I understand forward.
I mean, that's such a difficult question. In a place like India, it's very difficult to fund human rights, right? So you get groups like the Ford Foundation, for example, having to kind of make their funding look a lot more neutral and passive. But I would say their funding, from what I've seen, doesn't contradict human rights. Bill Gates, on the other hand, I think there has to be some values. What does human rights funding stand for? And you may be funding human rights in one space, if you're completely contradicting that in another space, I think that's highly problematic in your definition.
So you wouldn't want to see him?
I would not want to see Gates Foundation given what they've done, I would not want to see them as a human rights funder, and I think activists on the ground would really agree with that. And that's where you take your sign from. If the activists on the ground are saying, this is egregious and we won't take Bill Gates funding, that's to me the benchmark. I don't know, what do you think, John?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think we have to take our lead, and that's why I like your point around localization. We really have to take a lead from what local activists think it's acceptable. But I would also add to that, not necessarily the Gates example, but I think networks and collaboratives such as Ariadne and HRFN, Human Rights Funders Network, have a role to play in philanthropy education. Maybe Gates doesn't need it, but I think so many other philanthropists really want to do the right thing, but they need a lot more, and that's why groups, networks like Ariadne are really important to provide that space, that learning space, that networking space, that foundations can learn from each other, can compare notes, and can collectively improve practice. Maybe Gates doesn't need it, but I feel it's crucial, and that's why...
So consensus on the panel that Bill Gates is doing the wrong thing in this instance. What are other people's views and questions over there? Or on anything you've heard? Anything you've heard from the panelists about these issues? Please just feel free to raise your hands, ask any questions, comments.
Bill Gates is doing it in a lot of areas, so we can have a whole issue based on is the Bill Gates
unusually quiet in the audience today, but I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion on that. Please go ahead.
So firstly, apologies that I may be covering something which has already been covered because I was sitting in a hot tube for far too long. So I'm James, I'm with Forest Peoples Programme, and one of the things I'm interested in is around the link between collective rights and individual rights. And it links particularly to the area around climate change and people who are defending their land and their forests. But is there conversations around that? Because we find that people are often risking their individual human rights in order to protect their collective rights. And I'm wondering if there's thinking in that area.
I would say that philanthropy is definitely a little bit behind. In that respect, I would say individual rights have tended to be prioritized over collective rights issues. I think that is changing. As I think John sort of mentioned in some of his comments, I think philanthropy struggles a little bit with supporting movements and collective movements because it doesn't know how to do it. It always is sort of like, where's the NGO that I fund that's doing this, and a lot of times those collective efforts are in fact collective efforts that don't have the kind of professional hierarchy of here's the chair of the board who's responsible for the money that I'm going to give, and it creates challenges. I think it's something that many of the foundations that we work with are thinking about, they really want to do, particularly at the staff level. I think there's excitement about how can we actually start to support where change is really happening on the ground, and then it gets to the kind of higher levels and then it starts to break down a little bit, but there certainly are efforts out there, creations of funds, for example, specifically to support activists, and people are reevaluating the mechanisms that they have to enable that a little bit more. But I 100% think that it has not been as recognized as it needs to be until probably the last 5 years. Yeah.
I like to kind of look at the flip side, the other side to it, because oftentimes our support, especially in the Global South, has been couched in terms of communities. So even when I was talking today, you've heard me talk about communities so many times. So I think that is maybe a bit of a difference. Whereas in the Global North, oftentimes individual rights really do trump collective rights, and in the South, I think it's more around the notion of the community. And what I think that also has its own shortcomings. It means that often a focus on communities misses out, individuals within those communities, and oftentimes even, sometimes entrench those power dynamics, those hierarchical and economic disadvantages that certain sections or groups within the larger community or collective face. For example, a clear example is the status of women. Especially when it comes to land rights. I know Forest People's Program work on forests and land, and oftentimes we support groups that are pushing back or promoting their right to land. And what we forget that within these communities, women traditionally are already dispossessed of land. So when the community wins the right to land, if you are not really very particular or conscious about within this community, is not monolithic. There are so many people, individuals there, and if you are not careful about how this community affects everyone, you actually end up entrenching the very inequalities that you're wanting to fight.
So the importance of the intersectional approach, understanding how one set of rights and another may look.
I know in the closing space agenda there's been a lot of effort placed on HRDs and protecting human rights defenders, which, in communities where they're being attacked. And so that I certainly see more emphasis, with the exception of a few funders, looking at how do I protect those individual activists rather than kind of. And I think there's some useful framing emerging around managing the commons and the rights of the commons, and I think a lot more effort could be placed on that concept.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Back.
I think that highlighting the development of economic, social and cultural rights is really important, and I think one of the ways that we often think about it as a UK-based funder, I'm from the Barring Foundation, is that it actually often allows the read across between the global south and the global north in completely different ways, because here in the UK we're miles behind a lot of the work which is being done by groups in lots of other parts of the world. You can learn an enormous amount, and if you look at the kind of development which is going on in Scotland at the moment around this issue, and the political will which is there for potential incorporation, and how civil society is engaging with that and thinking about it, a lot of what they need are other models and engagement from people who've done it before and can walk that path. What role does philanthropy have in trying to build those bridges, particularly in the kind of developed networks which exist, and Ariadne or the Human Rights Funders Network, and what more should we be doing to think about that as a collective or as individual funders?
Julie.
I think it is this intersectional approach that we need to build, and that we have been trying as networks to think about, like, how do we start these conversations. Our Grant Skills Day last year was on intersectionality. How do you start to do that? And I think the challenge is with the kind of siloed approach that so many foundations have by definition. Just the way that they're set up organizationally doesn't really facilitate taking that kind of intersectional approach. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done within foundations, actually, that we can lead you to the water, but will you drink?
Perhaps you can comment on what you're doing in Berlin next year, where you're actually working with another organisation and another network in the field, which will hopefully bring different perspectives together.
Yeah. So Ariadne, for those of you who don't know, we have our annual policy briefing. It's a sort of a big annual meeting every year, and we're joining forces with EDGE Funders Alliance next year to hold our meetings back to back. And again, for those of you who don't know, EDGE Funders Alliance is focused on a just transition. They're really looking at systemic change. We're looking at social change. So we're going to have one overlapping day in the middle where we try to bring those perspectives together to, just to widen the conversation a little bit and bring in different perspectives on how this can be done. Because I think it is an institutional problem. You kind of get into the ethos of your own organization, into its way of doing things, and it's hard to see how to do it differently. And that's something that we hope that as a network we kind of help break that down a bit by giving you different perspectives of different human rights and social change funders, but this should expand it a little bit more to a really quite radically different approach in some cases to how change should happen.
And you signed an MOU between the two organisations
Yes.
to try to...
Yeah, we have
bring that
signed an
together.
MOU to try to align our work a little bit more and find ways that we can bring some life to these theoretical discussions of working together. But I think that is the problem, is that, kind of how do you start to integrate these different perspectives that you're hearing into the work that you're actually doing.
And why did you choose Berlin? There's been a lot of discussion about Berlin. OSF have moved there from Budapest. The Gates Foundation have an office there. Just reported about the Wellcome Trust, which is worrying about a no-deal Brexit, now have an office in Berlin. There's talk about Berlin as a hub of civil society activism, but there's quite a large but conservative German foundation sector. Was all of those factors on your mind, or was it just an accident?
No, all of those factors are on our mind. I mean, we also, for us, it's just, we move around every year, and that's a place we haven't been yet, but we felt that this was a good time to go there, because you say there's a large and conservative philanthropic sector. I'd say that is true, but I think it's a place where there's a lot of change happening and a lot of dynamism, and there's new leadership as of a couple of years ago at the German Association of Foundations, with a much more international, progressive approach than I think we've seen there before. And it's really been an opportunity for others in Europe to really engage there a bit more and see how can things change. And obviously Germany right now is in the throes of a lot of social issues themselves, with the rise of the AfD, the kind of neo-Nazi movement coming back, and divisions between East and West. So it's a good time, I think, to be having this conversation with German donors.
And Deborah.
Sorry, you were getting...
I was just saying, the interview that is relevant here is the piece with OSF on page 56, where talking about OSF coming to Berlin and the challenges they see in Germany as well, that Judy refers to. And it is a very interesting, they're developing the largest of the OSF offices outside of the New York headquarters in Berlin to be over 100 staff, 100 million euros of grant making. It could shake up, German and European philanthropy there. But Deborah.
Well, I think there's also a way that philanthropy can open its doors more to people who don't see themselves as working on human rights, and I think you can facilitate that conversation. So I used to work a lot on corporate accountability and in the finance sector in a number of areas, and as a campaigner, and we never sought funding from human rights funders. Our funding was sought from JRCT, social justice type funders, and I think there's a reframing that you can do in the way that you also describe your work to bring in that intersectionality in your funding portfolio, which would help groups as well to see that they're also working on human rights when they're working on economic and social and cultural power.
I wanted to add something there. I think it's a critical question, and one that especially groups in the Global South have been talking about for years, because I think the trend had been for experts, NGOs from the Global North going to the South to teach folks there how it's done, And in the past 5-10 years, we've actually been seeing a lot of push for a more kind of equal exchange and learning space. And I think philanthropy has a critical role to play there by not forcing collaboration. I don't think we should be in the business of forcing, but providing the space. Oftentimes, just having that opportunity, folks really need the platform, the opportunity to come together. And one area I think FIX has definitely done a lot good in this is around civic space. How do you push back? Because a lot of countries in the Global South have been experiencing shrinking, or most of these countries are closed spaces for a long time. And the Global North recently, or not too long ago, has now experiencing the same thing and really reaching out. I know FIX has been providing those platforms for that co-learning, that sharing. So I think philanthropy has a critical role to play in providing the space.
And one of the roles that philanthropy can play in keeping that space open is making sure that public opinion is supportive of creating that space open, because public opinion is a determinant of the appetite for politicians either to keep spaces open or resist pressures to close it. And I want to turn, if we could, just briefly, and we haven't discussed it as much as we might so far, to that issue of changing public opinion. There's an initiative in the UK, the Thomas Paine initiative over many years, to change public attitudes, and a great piece that was written just in the run-up to this issue by the Fund for Global Human Rights on public attitudes and tools and strategies that philanthropy can develop to try to, if you like, ensure that public attitudes are not as negative as they might be. It might be a good moment just to bring in James, who wrote that article. just to comment just about some of the learning and maybe on what initiatives are happening now, because that one is closing.
Ironically, although I'm writing about communications, I'm a terrible communicator, and I'm having put on the spot, so I'll try and come up with something which is insightful and meaningful. But I guess this actually links to the point that I was going to ask, which is, at the Fund we work across quite a broad range of issues. I think, it's not just civil and political rights, it's economic and social rights, it's environmental justice, it's women's rights, LGBT rights. So I guess we have the privilege of seeing the state of conversation in a lot of different foundation sectors. I was at the breakfast briefing, which took place 2.5 months ago, around peace building, and a lot of the same themes about how that movement needs to change came up. We need to localise, we need to organise at the community level, we need to tell our story differently, we need to be brave, we need more core and unrestricted funding. And my observation is that in all these spaces we're having conversations, the threats against activism, it's unbelievably siloed, but the pressures we're facing are generalised. We cannot solve these in silos. And I think we kind of touched upon how, what the affinity networks can be doing to, sort of build connections with the environmental movement around that, activism under threat, for example. But I think actually it'd be interesting to see Alliance sort of taking on some of these generic challenges which we're talking about and trying to link it, and rather than having an issue-based focus, to really think about, okay, how does philanthropy localise better? I find that really interesting.
But specifically on
communication, so
strategic
communications is
5 different points in your article that you wrote about communicating better.
That is a test.
I remember.
So the Thomas Paine initiative was something which came out of the political situation in the UK about 10 or 15 years ago, recognising that the Human Rights Act and human rights generally were being threatened by very hostile public conversation about human rights. Human Rights Act was a charter for villains and terrorists. It was being misused. And while the human rights community generally resorted to litigation and parliamentary advocacy in order to protect the laws, there was a conversation going on outside which it wasn't engaged in. The support for human rights was ebbing away, and if you looked at public polling. And so the Thomas Paine initiative was a funders collaborative which tried to sort of build public support for human rights. I think the key bits of learning we got to was, this is not just about a comms strategy, right? Comms is very important, we can tell our stories differently, there is a lot of research and evidence and expertise out there that we should be tapping into that we're not. But what we say is not the key point. What is more important is actually the kinds of issues that we're talking about, so the kind of bread and butter issues, we're not involved in there. We're rightfully, and I realise I'm wearing a nice suit and I'm in the city right here, we're rightly perceived as an elite. So when we're represented as an elite and human rights hasn't got anything to do with the public at large, it's no goal. So there are some much deeper shifts that need to take place within the human rights movement in order to build that public support. It's not just about what we're saying, it's about who we are, it's about what we're doing. 5 recommendations. The first is, this is a long-term strategy. Doing this in crisis, recognising, for example, we're about to lose the referendum, we need to suddenly tell our story differently. This is a generational thing. This is something that needs to take a long-term commitment to build public support. It's not something that can be done for a short-term project grant. And nor is it something that can just be cooked up. You need to bring the skills into the sector, and those can be very, very expensive. The second one is exactly that point about looking at common challenges that we need to work together across sectors. I'm featuring out here.
Yeah.
The third one is there are ways of bringing down costs as well. You know, one of the key things is recognising that some of the challenges we're facing, how can we get some of that expertise, some of the polling information, public survey, best examples, and really share that together across our issues. And then the other two, I think, were tremendously important. But I can't remember.
something about narratives being more important than statistics and facts, and using expertise about communications in order to reach audiences. Is that?
Yeah, I mean we all know this. You don't actually, if you negate a frame, if someone, for example, the classic one I see in Turkey is that, hashtag journalism is not a crime. There's all sorts of research that shows by negating a frame that the other side is setting, you're actually reinforcing it. And that is so well researched, so well known, and yet we can't help ourselves. Someone puts out a statement which we find provocative, we get drawn back into, the sort of denial, rather than actually telling our story positively. And I think, you bring it back to the UK, Project Fear, actually, it's not true about the lie on the bus. Actually, there are we were denying, we were sort of trying to show fears, we weren't telling a positive story about what European Union membership.
Julie, to what extent do you think your members and some of the human rights funders you work with are taking these issues seriously and funding them, and to the extent that they arguably need to receive funding to think about public opinion on human rights and more? Do you see a sense that they're willing to do that? So it seems quite striking that this initiative is winding down, possibly through lack of funding, at a time when maybe more effort needs to be made on building public support for human rights. Is it? Are there other initiatives that are taking its place?
I would say that this has definitely risen very high on the agenda for many of the funders that we work with. We do an annual forecast of what does the coming year hold for European philanthropy, and over the last year, probably the last 2 years that we've done that, narrative building, strategic communications have been one of the things that we've heard, not only from donors in the UK, but donors in other countries as well, that this is something that they're taking really, really seriously. So I think there's been a little bit of a wake-up call and now a scramble to try to figure out what do we do now? I think there's an increasing number of organizations sprouting up there that are able to help, but for a long time it was really kind of the Frameworks Institute that really had the expertise to do this, and they were a little bit overwhelmed, I think, by all of the donors coming to them, but now there's more expertise that's getting more dispersed, I think, around the field. But absolutely, it's something that funders talk about a lot. I think they want to do. What I worry is that they don't actually necessarily know how to do it well. And I think that's where there's still some learning that needs to be done. It's one thing to say yes, we need to communicate, but then how to actually do that in a really truly effective way, and not a way that's going to bring harm to your grantees or yourself, and really truly create that kind of narrative change.
Thank you. Any other comments either on that issue or others? There's a gentleman back and there's Duncan here. I'm just conscious of any women that want to say something. Men asking questions. Our next issue is on feminist philanthropy. Please.
I am a woman and I have a question. No, it's more, I haven't fleshed this out, which is why I haven't put my hand up, but then you prompted me to try. But, my name's Emma, I'm from Liberty, and we were funded by TPI for quite a long time through the duration of that work, and we're very sad that it wound down. But we also went on a real journey with it, and I'm trying to flesh out what my point is, and it's not criticism, but I just find it really fascinating, and it really threads into some of the challenges Liberty's facing right now, which was that a fantastic thing about our grant, which was entirely focused on expanding our communications team and honing our messaging and narratives around how we talk about human rights. But at the start, when we were applying, fleshing out what we could actually say we could achieve and how we were going to measure that when it comes to how we actually changed the public's minds and have we done anything was incredibly difficult. But of course we needed to set some targets and figure out ways of doing it. And the only way we could really say that at the start was, well, we'll get lots of mentions for the Human Rights Act and lots of positive mentions for the Human Rights Act. And focusing our lens on that and working with you guys and other grantees to speak more positively was fantastic. And we absolutely rinsed our targets on that front. I think over that year we increased our mentions of human rights by about 4,000 or something, and we got some fantastic coverage. And we really used our cases and our clients to flesh that out and bring their perspectives in and bring in outlets that would never normally cover our work, e.g. the Daily Mail absolutely hates human rights, but they were a huge fan of soldiers and we had litigation around military justice. So we kind of trained up our clients as spokespeople and did lots of effective work, got some coverage in the Daily Mail for that. But when it came to reporting back at the end of our grant, everything, because of how we'd outlined it at the start, the focus had to be around 4,000 mentions in The Guardian, and we didn't really have much chance to figure out how. We were trying to say, but actually, we said we'd do this and we have, but I don't want to tell you about any of this. What I want to tell you about is these 3 mentions we got in the Daily Mail and everything we're learning from that and how much harder it was to do the proactive work, securing that work and building those relationships compared to speaking to the journalists who have known us forever at The Guardian.
So what is 1 mention in the Daily Mail worth in terms of ratio to mention in the Guardian?
It's really difficult to figure out when
Yeah.
we'd actually achieved anything. And what we really learned from that was our own deficiencies when it came to monitoring, evaluating social change anyway, just generally, which is still a huge challenge for us. And it's something that increasingly is demanded very rightly by funders. And Sarah and I, she's also a friend of the team, we work together, are really trying to kind of use our funders and how that as a way to persuade our board and persuade our management teams that we need to invest in upskilling ourselves with monitoring and evaluation in the space. And we're really struggling. Even when we're going on training courses, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of expertise out there. And now that we're looking at economic, social and cultural rights, it's something that Liberty needs to focus on to address a huge disconnect that we're realising we have with the people who are supposed to be our beneficiaries. And everything that you're saying today is completely ringing true to what we're looking at prior in strategy. It's just bringing it more into focus, but we're struggling to get the funding to improve our monitoring and evaluation, and we don't know that much about it, and we're struggling to really reach out. And I don't know for other NGOs in the room how they're doing it, but I'm trying to figure out what the role of funders can or could be or should be in going beyond just demanding we get better at it and trying to really help us get better at it.
Okay, thank you for both of those points.
Can I
Before we
just
come
respond
back to
one
Hannah, I just
sentence?
want to bring in
I just want one response to that.
and then
Conservative funders do not demand M&E. There's a lot of evidence, and I could pull out the research, there's a lot of evidence that shows conservative funding is just blank check, do what you want. They don't demand the sorts of outcomes that liberal philanthropy does.
And have been more successful as a result.
And, well, that's a hypothesis, yeah.
So something to learn from them. Esther, from Global Dialogue.
Thank you, Charles. I'm Esther from Global Dialogue, and we house the Thomas Taylor Initiative and also FIX, the Funders Initiative for Civil Society. I'm just going to reply to Deborah before I come back to talking about TPI. One of the things that we wanted to do in TPI was to position strategic communications as a tool in the toolbox of equal value to strategic litigation, which has been long used by the human rights movement over several decades, so that communications was just as important as the law, and that a win in court was, a win of public opinion was of equal value, if not more important, than a win in court. And I think we're seeing that this week in British politics, where it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, actually what public opinion is just as valuable. So the right of weaponising that learning as well. And I want to come back on TPI and just say thank you for your feedback. It's been wonderful as we've been tying up that initiative to have those conversations with grantees and understand what they've learned. And thanks for coming on that journey with us. I want to say a couple of things about what we're doing next as legacy initiatives out of TPI. The first is thinking about how we can continue that learning journey and embed what we've learned within the human rights community and more broadly in philanthropy. So we're looking at developing a community of practice around strategic communication, specifically here in the UK, but then also internationally amongst the donor community. And I think early activities on that include Ariadne and the Human Rights Funders Network's joint webinars, which are going on through the autumn on different issues. There's been one on human rights, but I think there's one coming up on climate, migration, other disciplines that are also using strategic communications. But the second thing we're doing is just beginning to develop a fund which might test those ways in which we can democratise and localise human rights. And we're working with Citizens UK to try and scope that out, what that would mean in local communities. And I can come back and say a bit more about that in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you. And,
thanks.
Thanks, Esther.
Sure. Hi, my name is Jackie Geis. I run an NGO here called Deborah. I wanted to come back to one of the things that my head of M&E has been doing is that she has a knowledge or practice group with other M&E heads around London that meet on kind of like a bi-monthly basis and are able to kind of ask each other questions. And I'm happy to put you in contact because I do think that this is something, particularly in the human rights space, that we all struggle with, that impact and behavior change, which is a lot of what public opinion is that we're talking about here, takes decades to do, and generational, as I think John said earlier. And how do we measure and monitor and evaluate the impact of our work when really the type of changes, particularly if we're talking about strategic communications and public opinion shifting, is not going to happen in the 2 to 3 year grant cycle that we're providing, or that the time period that we're giving, but also 10 to 15 to 20 to 50 years out in the future. And how do we do that? So I'm happy to put you in contact with her and think about that. But I do think that that is a larger challenge for us as we kind of look into shift and move forward. And I really, as someone who used to sit in Washington, D.C. at a think tank, I know that there are blank checks a lot on the conservative side and not so much on the liberal side. And I think that one of the challenges that we are facing, and just to kind of elaborate on another one of your points, because I think it's really important, is the challenge of bringing in unlikely partners. And this is something that Julie said at the beginning, that I think that some of the forces that we're fighting against have been incredibly strategic in orchestrating unconventional alliances. And I do not think that we are as strategic or as forward-thinking in working with people that we might not agree with completely, but who are strategic for us to get to an end goal. And this is why I was slightly uncomfortable around the conversation about gates, because I do think that if we kind of take a very kind of black and white perspective on this, that we might eliminate people that could be helpful to us in the long term, or at least for short-term gains on the issues that we look at moving forward.
So how would you navigate that challenge? Because I think most people in philanthropy would probably agree with you, that actually it's important that that kind of funding, that level of funding, that capability that they and the foundation have is allocated in what we might broadly call human rights. That's a good thing, despite the challenge. So is this a conversation that just needs to happen internally without the public scrutiny that people like Alliance and others are trying to bring? Or is it just an uncomfortable reality of philanthropy that you're working with people in different ways and have to make compromise? And part of his logic is to make that accommodation in order for the win, which is, so well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I think it has to be in conversation with the people that you're working with and doing it. I mean, we work. I think another challenge of the human rights movement is oftentimes we're trying to bolster governance and rule of law and other actors, and those actors, we might, in one instance, we're working with an anti-corruption facility in the government. Are all of the actors in that space committed to our cause? Absolutely not. Do we think it's valuable to move that forward? Absolutely. And to understand that we're going to be able to seed back because those groups are able to do their job more effectively, whether through the investigative material that we provide them or through a different mean, or from what they learn from working with us longer term. And I think that by working with those actors, I think it's about a narrative and how we understand what this narrative looks like. And I think that a little bit of my personal opinion is that we've lost a lot of ground by fighting buyers in this movement. And people are looking at human rights, people that we're fighting against are looking at this in a much more strategic and long-term way. And we kind of need to develop a new paradigm shift about what we're looking at that has a much wider tent here, that is able just bring in actors from the corruption space, from other spaces that we need to look at to be able to move that forward. But I don't think that we have a narrative at the moment that is able to have that big tent.
Just bring in a couple of final comments from the floor before we go to the panel for your closing remarks. So, Duncan.
Yeah, first, just to react to that, I completely agree. I mean, in many ways, like both the problem and the solution for human rights is government and governance, right? So the idea of whether it's about engaging or not engaging, to me, is really missing the point when you're talking about Gates or anyone else. The reality is the Gates Foundation is a game changer for philanthropy. The scale of their funding in the health sector in particular is utterly changing the dynamics in global health, and therefore in health and human rights and in related fields. So not engaging with them doesn't seem like an option. And it seems to me that those in philanthropy have an opportunity and levers that those that we are supporting and grantees don't have, and likewise they perhaps have some that we don't have. So there can be a kind of distribution of roles in the holding to account and in the peer-to-peer discussions about accountability. I'm not sure where or to what extent discussions in philanthropy are happening around our own accountability. But if those of us who are on the, within human rights philanthropy and related sectors can start those discussions, they can have a ripple effect that might be of benefit across the board. That's just to react, and also to agree. I think a lot of the discussion is about what kinds of human rights work is needed to tackle the problems that we face today, which is quite right. But there are also challenges in how we as funders are operating. So, the need to support innovation but without being overly restrictive. Can we think of different ways of funding innovative communications or other kinds of human rights work? And there's some discussion about supporting through general support innovative projects, right? So the project idea is what opens the door to additional general support, but the grant itself is unrestricted, which is really, to me, is really interesting kind of balance. I'm not seeing it as either or, but seeing the benefits on both sides. And also the lesson, one of the lessons we keep talking about, conservative philanthropy, of the need to engage for the long term. And long term is not a 3-year grant. Long term is 15, 20 years of support to really bring about paradigm shift. So I think there's questions for us specifically as philanthropists. And then the last thing, which is the point I was going to make, a lot of this seems to be about letting go a little bit of the purity that we have as human rights people, activists. The purity around language, thinking about what people want to hear, not what we want to say. The purity about the kinds of work that is legitimate human rights work. Broadening the ecosystem. Conceptualizing human rights perhaps is about pushing back against abuses of power, whether that's corporate power or state power or individual power that is used without legitimacy, and mobilizing people. How can we ultimately mobilize more people to defend and claim human rights, whatever terms they're using for it? And I mean, let's embrace this comfort in doing that.
Thank you, Duncan, and maybe some insights into the direction of travel for Sigrid Rousing Trust, long-term funding, hybrid of core and project funding, combination with difficult issues, but I'm sure we'll see more. There's one final comment at the back.
Oh, there's actually two.
Two final comments at the back.
So I was going to ask the same question, make the same point about accountability and how we're holding each other accountable. I think it's crucial when we come back to the issue of public opinion. It's, I think, a lack of accountability sometimes in the human rights movement has had a massive impact. And we only need to look at recent scandals with major human rights organisations and what that's done to public opinion in the movement. So we need to look at ourselves too, right? But it's really supportive of that.
Good point. Thank you. What's your name?
Sorry, Rupert Abbott, I'm the director of an organisation called Give Out. We're giving to support LGBTQI human rights. Also used to work at Amnesty International, but no connection to my former company.
Thank you. A really important point about the accountability of the organisations themselves and the impact of some of the abuses that have been highlighted on public attitudes, not just to charities in general, but human rights in particular. Was there one?
Yeah,
you say
right
one
there.
question?
Hi, I'm Samira. I'm going to go back on it as well, if that's possible, regarding how, to what extent are we recognizing the power dynamics that exist within our circles and across the sector and challenging that. My question, if we had time for that, was we've talked about, strategic communications to change public opinion. To what extent and scale is our resources being invested in helping individuals within communities to harness and strengthen their own civic activism? You made the comment about not being subjects but being authors. So to what extent are we building on that civic activism, because there'll be strength in numbers. So you're not just that one human rights defender who's fighting for collective rights, but you have a community behind you. So to what extent is that happening right now within this field or across? And do you think it's necessary?
Thank you. If you can respond to that and make any final comments, that would be great. John?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I think I said that the kind of our comfort zone for philanthropists is to fund NGOs or collectives. That is easy. You need, and it's also helps for accountability, a board, and everything that comes with it. And what we've really not been good at is to support, I feel, like individual activists. There are times where groups or individuals are doing amazing activism in their communities, but don't necessarily want to form organizations. Or there are the examples of social movements I think Julie alluded to, that we find as founders or philanthropists very difficult to fund because they don't really neatly fit into our notion of an organization or what is fundable. And I think that has been a big challenge for the sector. And we've seen a lot of the dramatic, amazing changes that have really come from either those individuals or those movements. We see a lot of them, not just in the global north, but in the south. Recently in Sudan, what happened there is not necessarily coming from NGOs, the Arab Spring and all of that. And it's been difficult. And I just came back last week from a convening we had in Ghana, where social movements and traditional organizations are trying to really forge closer collaborations. And part of the challenge social movements are saying is we, the funders, are part of the problem, because once they spring out, they really value that spontaneous activism and response, but funders want to form them into an NGO. And once that happens, it saps away the energy. That spontaneity is gone. So how can we be, I think somebody said here about flexibility, adaptability, I think that we need to be brave as well to support more unusual forms of activism, both the collective, the individual, and sometimes the messy. It's really crucial, it's important, that we do.
Thank you, John. Julie?
I think this question of accountability within philanthropy is a very, very important one and a very, very hard one. If we take the Gates example, does Gates care that people, that groups in India are not going to accept his funding? Probably not so much. And that's what's hard, is this like foundations, and that's an extreme example, but even smaller foundations, they can actually make their own decisions, not really suffer any consequences as a result of that for the most part. Some donors obviously do care if they end up spread across the Daily Mail. Maybe that's like the point of accountability for some of them, but others, again, are just kind of quite content to do what they want to do and will accept whatever criticism comes their way. And I think that is what makes it so hard to hold the sector accountable, just being completely honest. I think the foundations that really have integrity are trying to find ways to, make themselves more open to that kind of criticism by opening up their processes and bringing the beneficiaries of the work into decisions, trying to engage them a little bit more to make sure that the funding is going to places that the field wants it to go and not what, the funder, specifically where the funder thinks is the best. But it is actually at the end of the day their choice to do that. And there aren't a lot of external mechanisms to hold them accountable. And I think that that is ultimately probably the weakness of our sector when it comes to these issues of public discussion and trying to justify who, the good that we're doing in the world. We can point to all of these things, but ultimately that's the vision of our, that we have for the world that we're supporting. And I don't have an answer to that one, but I think it is something that, all foundations really have to take quite seriously and think about, how am I responding to this and how can I make myself more accountable to the people that I am supporting.
Thank you.
On the issue of collaborating with Gates, I'm not actually against collaborating with Gates. Gates funds Guardian Development. I write for Guardian Development. I think it's about definitions, and I think the HRFN's efforts to pull together principles of human rights philanthropy, I think will... And Ariadne, sorry, Julie. I was about to mention Ariadne and something else. I think is really important, and I think that will help. It's about definitions of what is human rights philanthropy. So it's not about anti-collaboration, it's saying, what do we mean by human rights? And Ken, what you're doing, if that contradicts human rights, is that an issue in terms of calling you out as a human rights funder? So
Can I just make a small interjection there?
Please.
Small, brief. So we did a survey of all of our members, HRFN, Power, and Ariadne, and one of the questions that we asked was, does being a human rights funder mean how you fund, not just what you fund? And we had like a 97% yes answer to that question.
There you go.
Go ahead.
Just on the last point, I think the Ariadne publication on funding community organizing in Europe explains a lot about how you support people to be activists in their day-to-day lives, citizen activists. I think there's some insights in that, so I would recommend that. I think the final point is, I do think we need to learn more from conservative philanthropy. And one definition I'll give that was given by a colleague about a Washington-based think tank, conservative think tank. They start out the year with 200 high net worth individuals or foundations, 200 people, they're all on their board, and they all have to give $200,000. So they start their year with $4 million in unrestricted funding as a think tank to do whatever the hell they want. I'm not saying we should just fund people to do whatever they want, but I think there is some value in thinking big and unrestricted and that long term. So they started these conservative projects 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I think the long-term message and the openness and the bravery is the key thing for me.
Thank you, and that's an important point to end on that long-term funding. I'm about to wrap up. Angela, if you want to make it very brief before you...
I just want to make a quick book, Angela from Holding Back on the Charitable Foundation. I wanted to make a quick book recommendation, a book that came out a couple of years ago called Dark Money, which is a very good outline for exactly how conservative philanthropy works and how it was so very successful, taking some of the points that you bring up, but it's largely about the Koch brothers.
And Dark Money, written by Jane Meyer from The New Yorker, for those that haven't heard of her. And about the Koch brothers, one of whom has recently formed a partnership with George Soros. So talking of unusual alliances, we've got a little news feature in Alliance about it. On that point about unrestricted funding, and without being too self-referential, for organisations like Alliance that work in the philanthropy-focused media, to be able to hold philanthropic institutions to account as well as to tell the story of philanthropy, having that arm's length funding in the form of support for property or having an office, which would be our own, or an endowment, gives us that independence, in the absence of which it's hard to be able to do our job without the daily risk of self-censorship. So the point about Bill Gates was not to suggest that human rights funders shouldn't collaborate with him. The question was more about why is he collaborating with Modi and endorsing him, and what implications there should be for human rights funders as a result of that. And the Gates scholars at Cambridge University have written a letter raising that question, makes it a legitimate subject of public interest, and a philanthropy media and other media should be subjecting that to scrutiny, and, as well as gratitude for the work that they're doing. And that's the spirit in which we, at Alliance and other philanthropy media publications, I think, are and should be approaching our work. But I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming today, for making us a typically rich conversation at a time when there are real pressing and acute issues for human rights. Thank you to CAF for hosting us, long-standing friends and partners of ours. Thank you to Julie and John for guest editing this issue, along with Carola in Corazzoni in Italy, and Deborah for her responses. Please do give us your feedback, however critical it is, in the spirit that I was mentioning. The next Breakfast Club will be looking at our special feature on feminist philanthropy in December, and it'll be a really, really provocative issue. If you subscribe today, you will get 20% off your subscriptions and be able to come to that event and future events for free as a subscriber. So finally, I'd just also like to say thanks and pay tribute to the Alliance team here, been sitting quietly and holding me to account. Sometimes I'm Zibran here on the left, Anna, our intern from the US, and Amy at the back. If you put your hands up, Amy, if you want to subscribe or sign your name up early for the next breakfast debate on feminist philanthropy, she's the person to go to. I really hope you found the discussion useful for the work that you're doing, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you very much.